I want to thank Dunja and Elaine and other organizers for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak to you all. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing the screen and hopefully this will work. All right. In general, I guess what I will be talking to you about is uh, some of the work that we've been doing, my lab has been doing really in the last, gosh, I guess almost 2.5 years now, um, and where we're going and the kind of progress that we've made so far. So very quickly, in 2023 or even earlier, really, there was such a overswell of hype and marketing from every corner of the media space about generative AI and all the amazing things that it can do for our society, for jobs, for businesses, and so on. Um, and really, this has come from business schools, from business banks, from financial analysts, from all corners, and many of which were more, bias free, which were more independent. But I want to point out that, something that oftentimes gets confused or conflated is that there are really two types of AI. What we think about in terms of AI today, largely is generative AI. And generative AI was not even around before 2022 in a real shape or form. One can maybe argue that GANs were generative AIs, but really that's sort of nitpicking. But prior to 2022, there was a whole decade worth of useful AI in terms of what actually, unfortunately, many people call discriminatory AI, but really just in terms of classification, identifying cars, identifying animals, identifying people on the road, identifying cancer in mammograms, and so on. And all that research is still ongoing. Medical imaging, climate modeling, all that still is happening today. So I want to really separate that kind of great work, which has no ethical quandaries, no sort of misuses, really, separately from the generative AI stuff that we're really, I think, mostly talking about today. And the reality of sort of generative AI, particularly generative AI content in 2024, obviously we're already in 2025, but most of these sort of headlines were in 2024 really show a very, very different picture from what people predicted back in the days, right? We're seeing basically consumers and society in general recoil from content that's been generated by AI because it is recognizable. It does have that sort of inhuman plastic feel, despite how much better it gets, right? And to the point where brands and advertising agencies and companies are basically staying away from AI images as much as they can. Companies like Magic the Gathering, Lego, Eon's other companies are basically apologizing for uh, inadvertently using AI in their advertisements, in their magazines, in their news media. And even advertising agencies and magazines are warning companies to stay away from AI because of reputational risk. So one might argue, and I will argue this, that it is actually a bubble bursting in real time. So I know that we're talking today about a lot of the negativity around sort of the space. And sometimes for artists in particular, it does seem quite dark. But I want to say that it actually is turning around from, just from talking to journalists from 2022 till today, the conversations are very different. Media now talks about how AI, billions of investments going into AI and whether we're actually getting benefit. And this is coming from Wall Street. This is coming from, the main news outlets now, things that we have not seen, since the early days of AI. And so this is changing. And I don't have the time today, but I can also talk about sort of financially how basically the revenue is just not coming in. And for many of these companies like Anthropic and Perplexity, some of these companies that are built up, their values are all built up based on venture capital and predictions of revenue. They will fall and they will fail within some reasonable amount of time. Personally, I would guess actually in less than 2 years. That funding will run out, and we're going to see a very different sort of world around AI. So what I'm trying to say is that, we are going to still talk about sort of some of the harms and how to mitigate them in the meantime. But I do think that in 2-3 years, things will look really, really different. So there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, if you will. Okay, so let me talk about some of the current harms that are happening today, right? So I think many of you are well aware of this. Even as early as 2023, Clark's World, that was one of the first implications of what happens with generative AI on human creatives. Sci-Fi magazine that used to run an annual sci-fi writing competition had to turn off or had to cancel the competition because they were being flooded with plagiarized short stories. Basically, people using AI to summarize and rephrase existing tools and then claim them as their own. You could see this similarly in publishers. You could see this in generative AI taking people's likenesses and voices, in this particular Tom Hanks case, but also Scarlett Johansson, obviously. I think many people have heard about these examples. But generally trying to mimic real people, taking their voices, their likenesses, and then misusing them without their permission. Um, Obviously, other risks as well, even more sort of disgusting and gross attacks based on phishing, based on scamming behavior. Again, mimicking particular individuals in order for criminals, for example, to gain money or perform extortion. So I want to come back to artists, though, aside from these sort of societal ills. But I think some of you may know Kelly McKernan. Kelly is a artist who I've gotten to know quite a bit in the last 2.5 years, I think. And she was nice enough to show me some of her art. But really, over Kelly's career, she spent I think probably close to 30 years of her career honing her skills as an artist. Some of the pictures I've seen start with her as a very young child, maybe 7, 8 years old, drawing, creating paintings on the sidewalk with just chalk. Right. And obviously, over the years, she's gotten quite good as an independent artist, selling art in galleries, becoming a fully, professional artist who's able to support her own family. But one day she wakes up in 2022 to find out that over 50 of her paintings were scraped into the Lay on 5e database, obviously without consent, obviously without compensation or credit. And to be trained on is one thing, but then of course in Kelly's case, she was one of the first few people to see that she was also being mimicked as well. And some of these generative AI models were able to, with the help of her existing works of art, they were able to basically mimic her with startling accuracy. So on the right, the biggest image right there is one of Kelly's original paintings, but all the little smaller ones, and the other two on the very far right are also her paintings. And the 16 smaller images are condensed, smaller versions of images that these models were able to generate given this particular prompt. Okay, and of course, Kelly is not alone. This is actually quite common now. Greg Dutowski, a very well-known fantasy artist in Poland. Greg has unfortunately become the poster child of being mimicked in generative AI models. I believe, some of the last numbers I saw were that basically every month in Midjourney, his name is routinely used something to the tune of over 100,000 times to generate images that, of course, he did not create or give permission to. So this general problem is now happening quite a bit to a lot of artists. As you can see more samples here, the mimicry really can be quite detailed and can be fairly accurate in capturing texture, in capturing composition, in capturing color palette. Not so much the emotional tone, not surprisingly, because AI does not have any humanity in it, obviously. And so today you can actually go on sites like Civit AI and you can actually see what some people call democratizing art styles, right? Today, democratization is a very convenient euphemism essentially for stealing things without compensation or credit. I believe, at one time I gave a keynote at a conference and an engineer in the background in the Q&A session asked, well, what about democratization and isn't that always good? And I reminded him that we walk down the street all day and we see people, and we don't feel the need to democratize anyone of their purses or their wallets or their personal possessions. So anyway, so if you go on some of these sites now, you can actually see hundreds of thousands of models basically that have been created to mimic individual artists. And this was something that was really starting to happen in 2022, picked up steam in early 2023. I would say that in perhaps recent years, in the last year and a half or so, it's slowed down a little bit and it's gotten more concentrated. But I won't speculate on exactly why yet. On Zipit AI, you can also see other models, of course, models that are particularly focused on, unsurprisingly, on young women, particularly attractive women, high-profile actresses, musicians, and so on. I will point to that. If I'm not sure if you guys recognize who this guy is down the bottom in the middle. That is Ted Cruz, and I had to work really, really hard to find a model that actually output images of men. I had to scroll for a good probably 15, 20 minutes down many, many models to find this one single model. And the only reason that there is such a model with a guy as its particular output is that there is a model that is designed to produce deep fakes of the members of Congress in the US government. And because there are plenty of men in the US government and Congress, this model actually produces images of men. But outside of that, almost every single model targets women, particularly young women, and so on and so forth. And of course, unfortunately today, companies like this are actually getting funding from some of the biggest venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. So obviously, mimicry is highly disruptive to artists' livelihood. And this has been happening really, I think, since 2022. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline in a little bit. But obviously, one of the challenges for independent artists is that they have to put their own art samples of their artwork online. That is how they get contracts. That is how they get new jobs with entertainment companies, movie studios. That's how they get independent commissions. That is the only way that they basically generate their own income to support themselves as an artist. And so having this threat of mimicry basically puts them between a rock and a hard place. They can either try to minimize their online footprint, in which case they're effectively sabotaging their own source of income, or they can continue to do what they do at this risk of one day waking up to discover that their entire career is effectively over because now they've been pulled into a particular model. And anyone can wear them like a skin to create images that they have absolutely no say in and no consent. So obviously this has led to quite a bit of mental stress and anguish for artists worldwide. Many of them are quitting. This is something that you can really see online and it's all over the place. These are just some of the many, many screenshots that you can see, articles and Twitter posts and all sorts of social media posts. Some of them actually do get quite dark. This was already something that was quite early on. This was in 2023. Art students in Japan feeling absolute despair over what was going on with AI. So this is something that, this is not just affecting people today, but it's also affecting art schools, downstream impact in a very significant way. I live in Chicago, and one of the sort of very famous old Chicago art schools, American Academy of Art College, closed after 101 years in the summer of 2024. But, not surprisingly, this was not just a single incident. In Philadelphia and Delaware, other places, more than century-old art colleges were closing because, effectively speaking, because of drops in enrollment. And even the schools that were not closing were effectively cutting down their budget quite a bit because of drops in enrollment. Some of them were shuttering entire departments, particularly illustration and some of the other departments that were most hard hit by AI. And of course, it's not just our schools as well. In New York City, some of the very well-known sort of art galleries were also closing. Just more signs of disruptions to the artist pipeline and the ecosystem as a whole. So this is all, of course, bad things, right? And so this is sort of the world that we came into. This is a picture of Heather, who is my co-director at the SAN Lab, and some of our graduate students, a couple of them who have already graduated, and of course, many, many artists that we've worked with. So let me tell you about some of the things that we've done. As I think Elaine was talking about, sort of, pushing back against surveillance. Actually, that type of work we started quite a few years ago. In particular, in 2020, excuse me, we had a project called Fox, named for Guy Fawkes, the British history figure. But the Fox project basically used machine learning tools to alter your images of your faces in such a way that AI models or any third party using AI models could not simply download your photos and then train a facial recognition model of you. And when we were creating this tool in late 2019, I thought it was a sort of a hypothetical, a futuristic dystopian future that we were trying to prevent as we were building this tool. And it turns out that as we were submitting this finished technical research paper, that week, the New York Times unveiled an article that showed that this was already happening today. A company named Clearview.ai was already, or had already, downloaded billions of photos and created facial recognition models of hundreds of millions of people. So it turns out Fox was quite timely, and it got quite a bit of attention and a lot of users around the world. So flash forward to June 2022, we get this very interesting email from an artist, Kim van Doen in the Netherlands, and Kim basically asking, this very interesting question of, can Fox protect art? And we were, of course, very, very confused. I in particular remember writing a reply and basically saying, why does art need protection? And so sorry, but this tool is for facial recognition only. So Kim responded by inviting us to a town hall hosted by the Concept Art Association, one of the bigger art association groups in the US. And in November 2022, I got on a Zoom call with Sean, one of my senior PhD students, and Heather, and the three of us watched a few hundred artists talk about the negative impacts of AI and how it was turning their world upside down and disrupting their careers and income and their ability to support their families. So right after this, I think, I remember coming off that Zoom call just completely blown away. And the three of us started working on what would become eventually this thing called Glaze. We worked with a ton of artists in the process, about over 1,200 professional artists, to ask them to help evaluate the prototype that we developed called Glaze. February of 2023, we submitted the paper, it got some press, New York Times, etc. By March, we did the first alpha level software release of Glaze. By July, we hit 1 million downloads. By August, actually, the paper was finally actually presented and published at the top security conference. And we also released Web Glaze. So let me talk a little bit about what mimicry, how it works, and what Glaze does. In a very, very oversimplified way, this is a sort of a picture representation of what an AI model thinks of images and image features. Okay, so it has a very mathematical view of a high dimensional space, but we can think of it, reduced down to 2 dimensions. Certain types of art features belonging and labeling with a particular artist name, let's say Picasso or Jackson Pollock in this particular region. And the more it trains on a particular artist's work, the more it'll have a more clear view of which regions, which portions of the art space belong or are associated with a particular artist. Okay. And when you run, so that's why, you're able to basically generate images. For example, you say, give me a painting in the style of Picasso. It'll see that name, it'll find that region associated with Picasso, and it'll generate a painting or image more or less randomized in that space, but defined by that space it already understands. Now, if you try to mimic a new artist, let's say Carla Ortiz, one of my friends, and who's really quite prolific and a well-known artist. She's done art in all the Marvel movies, Black Panther. She designed the costume for Doctor Strange, all these things. But you can take her personal fine art and you can train it. And what you will do is when you fine tune a model on Carla's art, it will teach this particular model that certain region of the art space, the visual feature space, should be labeled with the name Carlo Ortiz. And now if someone were to come along and say, I want to image a painting in the style of Carlo Ortiz, the model will understand that it is in this region that it will take and generate a random image from. And as you can see, the output actually looks quite eerily similar in text style, texture, palette, color palette to the original. Now, so how do we protect this, right? And what Glaze does is, technically speaking, this is called data poisoning, this technique, but it's never been applied to the art world or diffusion models in general. So what Glaze does is it takes these images, it runs it through a filter, and it computes a fairly mathematically complex function in order to change the way that the AI model sees this image. And so in particular, what it does is that it tells the AI model that, in fact, Carla's art features, features that define Carla's images, are not actually here, but they're actually over here, okay? Distorting what the AI perceives mathematically from Carla's images. And so now this idea is that Carla's name is now associated with that particular region of the art world of the feature space. And if someone were to say, as for a painting by Carlo Ortiz, they would perhaps get something that was much more akin to a Jackson Pollock. And that's, of course, our goal, right? And so the informal, the mathematics, I'm not going to really get into it here, but it is what we typically call multi-constraint optimization problem fixed on a bounded, image budget. But I'll skip that. So here's an example of sort of an image from Carla, one of Carla's actual original paintings, and then the glazed version of that. And of course, you can actually blow this up on a high-res computer monitor. And I think even Carla occasionally has trouble identifying which is which. And this is a result of quite a few iterations of the glazed prototype, but we'll talk about some of that later on. Some more examples. On the two columns on the left are the examples of original art. Nathan Folks is another artist that we work closely with. Monet and Van Gogh, of course, everyone is familiar with. The two columns in the middle are images that are produced by AI models that have been told to mimic those original artists. And as you can see, the mimicry is more or less successful. Some of the color contrast is a little bit off, particularly for Van Gogh, but in general, it does an okay passing sort of level of quality. And then, but what happens is that if you take the same model and you tell it to learn or train on protected versions of these images, the results look quite different. When you ask it to generate mimicries, you'll see styles that are actually quite a bit different from Nathan, quite a bit different from Monet. That looks like some sort of, an abstract surrealism for Van Gogh, a little bit of cubism for Monet, and I don't know what that is for Nathan. But obviously, those two columns on the right are what we would consider successes. I'm gonna probably, because of the time, I'm gonna skip a little bit about the deployment story of how we deployed Glaze, except to say that it was quite a stressful process. But some more examples here. The original Glaze had trouble with certain types of imagery. In particular, if you think of black and white comics like Sarah Anderson's work or Maggie Chan's artwork, which is very smooth in sort of color gradients. These are challenging for Glaze to work with because there's almost no texture. There's no place for Glaze to alter, even subtly, pixels and not have them be immediately visible to the human eye. And of course, Glaze actually changes something like 80 to 90% of all pixels in an image when it processes it. And so it is difficult for it to basically condense that level of AI information to try to disrupt AI training into very, very small regions where it has no place to store that information. So the early version of Glaze 1.1, you can see show visible distortions for color for images like this, where there was very little texture. Over time, we did figure out different combinations of optimization algorithms, different schemes and algorithms that we could pre-process with in order to generate much smoother results. We could spread the changes that Glaze was making across more corners of the images and focusing on areas of the image that are rarely looked at by the human eye and therefore have a much lower visual impact. Deployment was challenging again. I will skip some of these detailed stories because of time, but the overall experience has been overwhelmingly positive. It has now been actually slightly over 2 years now, 24 months, since Glaze was first introduced and released as a software. It has now been downloaded, I believe, as of earlier this year, I think in January. The download count was 6.7 million global downloads by artists all around the world, everywhere from California to New York to Argentina, Sweden, South Africa, Israel, Malaysia, and Beijing and Korea. So we've been thrilled. The 8.9 million downloads actually includes Nightshade, which I will try to briefly talk about. And we've received a number of awards and whatnot. That's fine. And more importantly, we've been able, because of these tools, to work together with creatives and across a multitude of industries, writers, voice actors, musicians, choreographers, you name it, art schools, museums, unions, and also importantly with governments around the world, actually, but most strongly with state legislators in California and Illinois to actually change laws regarding AI. But also the Copyright Office in the US, the Federal Trade Commission, and different government branches inside the US. So this has actually led to significant progress. In 2023, I would say I testified in front of 2 different state committee hearings, and that's actually led to a number of bills. I think I testified in regards to 4 different state bills, all of which were signed into law, 2 in California, 2 in Illinois. I won't get into the details, but they were fairly important, impactful, and groundbreaking. And even today, in fact, this week, um, I am actually actively working on a new bill in California that will have hopefully even more far-reaching impact. All right, so with I think maybe perhaps a little bit more than 3 minutes, I want to briefly mention Nightshade, which is a little bit more what's the word? Perhaps offensive as opposed to defensive for Glaze. All right, and I would just point out that tools like this really protect everyone, not just individual creators, but even companies with intellectual property. For example, companies like Nintendo now see other smaller companies generate content that looks surprisingly like Nintendo's own content, in this particular case, Pokemon, and then market them as their own. And of course, the only thing that Nintendo can really do is basically sue them in court. But this is a problem because today, intellectual property companies, this is all they can do is go to court. But really, in most cases, the legal process takes forever. I'm actually involved as a testifying witness on quite a few of these class action lawsuits today, but they are really, really slow in moving. So what Nightshade does is, effectively speaking, it acts kind of like Glaze, but what it does is that it actually changes the composition instead of the style. So, for example, you take this photo of a dog, you can make some very controlled changes to it using Nightshade, and then, of course, the result, again, is meant to look basically identical to the original, to the human eye, but to the AI model, it actually looks quite different, right? So this image of a dog sitting in some grass, sitting in some weeds, actually look to the AI model like a, close-up of a big tabby cat. Okay. And of course, what this does is that actually teaches models something completely different from what they want to learn, disrupting their training process. Okay. And I won't get into this, but if people care, well, I can answer questions. But there's a number of tricks to make Nightshade images much more attractive to the original, to benign images for the models. And so models will actually disregard benign images that it's already seen in favor of what these new Nightshaded images teach it. So here are examples. This is out of SDXL, one of the bigger, sort of more successful models in recent years. The top row, you'll see lots of different images generated by a normal version of SDXL. And there are a bunch of things that we won't like the model to change their ideas to. Okay, and so if you show it 50 poison samples, for example, of this model using Nightshade, this model will start to think that dogs have maybe 6 legs, and cars look really weird, and handbags and hats, they start to look a little funky. And after 100 or even 300 images, now the model is convinced that the dog actually looks like a cat, the car actually looks like a cow, and when you ask it for a hat, it will actually produce a nice slice of cake with a fork and a plate and everything else. Okay. Finally, I will mention that there is more to this. It turns out that we can actually make models implode once there's sufficient content from Nightshade into the system. Nightshade was released in basically January last year. It's now hit, roughly speaking, basically, a little bit more than 2 million, a little bit more than 2 million downloads in 2024. Okay, and then I will fast forward to today. Basically, we've gotten a number of awards for this and things of that sort, but the work really continues. We're working on not only trying to get the community, the research community in general, to try to work on similar kind of research problems with some success. There's now a number of groups outside of our own who are working on similar kind of issues to try to protect artists and creatives. But we ourselves are also working on different problems to try to enhance protection for artists to authenticate their own work, to expand our protection to different modalities, and to also address other issues like deepfakes and undressed apps and so on. Okay, so I will stop there. I know I'm probably a little bit over on time, and I'm more than happy to take any questions. Thank you.